So I'm making the Colby bra by Petite Stitchery Company. It has all cup sizes from A and above and band sizes, I think from 28 inches and up. And this is the non-lace version that I'll be making. It requires fabric that has 50% stretch both ways. So what I mean by that, it would take a wide variety of fabrics, but your fabric will be able to stretch this way 50% and this way 50%. Megan Nielsen Patterns has a stretch calculator that you can just print out and stretch your fabric along her measurement ruler. I find that works really easily, but basically you want your fabric to be able to stretch 50% both ways. So for the non-lace version, you need 4 of your cups and 2 of your back. For the fashion fabric, 2 of your back of your lining, 2 of your front for the fashion fabric, and 2 of your front for the lining, plus your band fabric. When you're cutting out all of your fabric pieces, you have to have mirror images. So I'm cutting here face down, and then the next time I cut, I'm going to flip my pattern to be face up, and then I'll have mirror images. So I will get started once I finish cutting out my fabric. Also, I don't get too carried away with the grain line. Obviously, I do think about it, but the parts of your pattern that are straight, like this center front edge and the center back edge, I just make sure that it's at a full angle, a 90-degree angle to the ribs of the fabric. That way I can use up tiny little pieces of scrap fabric. And because the pieces are tiny, I don't worry too much about them being on grain. I literally just eyeball it. If it's looking like it's straight along the ribs of the fabric, I'll cut it. So I'm slowly recording how to make all the patterns that I have in case my daughters or my son one day wants to sew with the same patterns. It's so easy to see a video and just replicate everything. So the first thing you want to do after you've cut everything out on 50% 4-way stretch fabric is make sure you have 2 of everything. So I always lay things out like it would be on my body. And now once you've made sure you have enough of everything, the first thing to do is to sew the cups to the curve on your front inner cup piece. So we'll be taking them like this, the outer curve to the inner curve. So this is the outer curve, goes to the inner curve. And what you'll do is you'll pin each at the top and at the bottom, and then work your way in towards the middle. So we're going to pin at the very bottom and at the very top. You can overlap that point by the seam allowance, which is 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch. You can overlap it just a tiny bit if you want. That makes room for the seam allowance. And then you're going to fit that outer curve into the inner curve. With the knit fabric, it's pretty easy to do. Sometimes, you know, you can just kind of stretch it into place. I like to put a little bit of the curve right in the middle, so I don't do any pulling or stretching for the first inch or so at the bottom. And then I slowly make my way to pinning that. So I'll pin them all and then I will be back. So this is what you should have. You should have your pieces right sides together, and this is going to be eased in, this top outward cup. You have to ease this in. You can pull on the lower piece a little bit. I do advise the bigger piece, the cup piece, putting on your feed dogs of your sewing machine, and that's going to help feed it through. If you have a walking foot, that's also really helpful when sewing knits, or of course a serger. So go ahead and sew this either with a zigzag stitch, a lightning stitch, or a serger. I'm going to be sewing this on my serger, and I'm going to start from the bottom and go up towards the top. And I'm going to try to, I'm not going to sew in a straight line. I'm going to be sewing and using that curve to maintain the pattern. And you can see that I'll be stretching this top bit just a little bit to help ease it in. And although the seam allowance is 1 centimeter, I just use my serger and just kind of do basically 1/4 of an inch. It all seems to work out. And then you'll have your cup eased into your front piece, and that's what it should look like. The next step, if you like, is you can take your iron and you can press these seams towards the center and then top stitch or cover stitch on top of that seam right in here to keep it in place. You can do that with a zigzag stitch, stretch stitch, or cover stitch, anything that stretches. Lightning stitch, you can top stitch down there, which I'm going to do now. Just on the outer pieces, you don't need to do that on your lining. So I'm top stitching that seam in place. You will want to do this if you're using this for athletic wear to keep the seam flat against your skin, or if you like the look of top stitched athletic wear or bras. And I do. I just think it makes it look like a ready to wear piece. If you're having problems with your machine sucking any fine fabric down or not starting very well, you can start with a piece of tissue paper underneath. And I actually like to do that kind of out of habit and with knit fabric. So I just have a piece of tissue paper. I just kind of start it at the end so it doesn't get stuck. And I have my machine on a stretch stitch. It's this one right here. And I have my walking foot on because I really, really love my walking foot when I'm using stretch fabric or knits fabric. And I'm just moving my needle over a bit so I can catch that seam. And so I'm just kind of spreading the fabric, making sure it's flat here. I'm not stretching it, I'm just spreading it. And I like my top stitching at a bigger or longer stitch length. So I usually top stitch my knit fabrics at 4, stitch length of 4. And you can see that with a stretch stitch, the machine just goes backwards and forwards. And again, I'm just making sure that seam is going towards the middle. And I'm following the curve. And there's no need to rush. And sometimes with knits, when you're at the very end, it's easiest not to backstitch. You can either tie the threads manually or use your knot function on your machine if you have that. But yeah, sometimes going backwards at the very edge of the fabric is not advisable. And that's my stretch stitch with my machine. And you can just tear that paper off, but it helps to get the machine started. So I'm going to do that to the other side and then I will be back. So we're still working on our front pieces, and if you've top stitched, you'll have one set top stitched. And now we're going to sew up this center seam here. So we are going to go right sides together and sew the straight edge here, again with a zigzag, a serger, lightning stitch, whatever you have available to you. And we're going to do that to both the lining and the main fabric. So sewing this straight edge, that's right here. That's the next step. The pattern says to press this center front seam open. Because I've serged it, I'm not bothering to press it open, but you can if you like. Now we're working on the back. When you look at your pattern, this is the center back seam right here, this small piece here. And what we're going to be doing is on both your main fashion fabric and your lining is you're putting these right sides together and you're sewing that very small seam. So the same thing, we're going to sew right here, and either however you've been sewing your knit seams with a serger, zigzag, lightning stitch, whatever stitch you prefer. And again, I don't know if you can see that, but the pattern has you pressing the center back seam open. I'm not going to bother to do that. The next step is putting these together at the shoulder seam. So you have two sets. So make sure you put your fashion fabric and your back piece right sides together. So let me see if I can go out here with the camera. This is my lining, so I'm putting them right sides together, both pieces. So I have them right sides together, and we'll be sewing at the shoulder seams. So both sets, sew across the shoulder seams at 1 centimeter. As a side note, many people do add elastic into their seams, especially with sports bras, which this is. So I'm going to be adding any type of elastic you have, really. I'm going to be adding elastic into my seams. You can also use clear elastic too, which is great for reinforcing all of your outer seams. And I will be adding it to the shoulder seams, my underarm seam, and the neck seams. So I'm just going to serge these shoulder seams right sides together with just a little bit of elastic to help give those seams some stability. And sometimes the trick to sewing elastic is to start the stitch on the elastic first before you even get on to the fabric, which is what I've just done. Let me put that over. And sometimes machines don't like it, but it will eventually accept it. I have this really thick elastic, which is not the best to sew with, so I might just switch to my clear elastic. But this is what your seam will look like. Your seam should look like this when it's done. So I'm going to do that to all 4 shoulder seams, sew them together. So I've sewn my main fashion fabric together with the elastic, so my lining I won't bother putting the elastic in the shoulder as long as one set has elastic, or you can omit it as well. So what you should have is your front and back sewn together at the shoulder seams. And now it's time to connect them. So you should have your lining face up and your fashion fabric face down on top of each other, just like that. And what we'll be doing next is we'll be sewing up this center V neck and adjoining them at the shoulders. Now your seams, you should, if you can, if you haven't ironed them flat, what you want to do is nest these seams. So you want to have one going one way and the other going the other way so that you don't get things too bulky. And if you want, sometimes it's nice to even just baste it down first to make sure that's how it goes underneath the machine when you're sewing. So that is the next step, is putting the pieces right sides together and sewing along this V here. You can, if you like, and I will be sewing elastic along this whole thing. And what you're going to do is do that in 2 stages. She has really great directions on this. But basically, you're going to start at one end and cut the elastic to match your seam. So you can butt the elastic against the seam. Let's see if I can just, I've already cut it, so I just want to get a little closer. So what you can do is you have your elastic and you want to just cut it right up against the seam, so it's just going to match. And then you're going to sew it with a zigzag stitch all the way across the shoulder to the other side, and you're going to cut it at an angle so it matches the seam here too. And then you're going to do the same thing for the other side so that the elastic ends abut each other. And I'll demonstrate that as soon as I've sewn this side. So that is the next step. We're going to be joining it at the middle. So sewing from one side over the shoulder seam to the other, center front or center back. So Petite Stitchery has a really good instructions for this bra, and they also have a video how to add the elastic to the neckline here. You're not pulling the elastic. This is just for stability. Unless you happen to have some gaping somewhere on your muslin, you're really not pulling this elastic at all. You don't want puckering. It's just to ensure a stable edge. You also want to be applying this elastic with a zigzag stitch on your regular machine. So this is a place in this project where you do want to take your time. Lots of places you can kind of speed through. No one's going to notice, but this, you really want your shoulder seams aligned and nested the opposite ways. Same with your center front and center back. So you can see I've pinned those 4 locations first, and now I'm just going to lay my elastic and make sure everything is neatly laid out before taking it to my machine. So I'm just placing my elastic down. There's no rush, unless you have a hot date tonight or something. There's no rush. So make sure that shoulder seam stays nicely nested. And I'm going to bring this right to the edge, and I'll show you how I cut that. The instructions are very good. But basically, I'm just going to follow it so I can cut. I'm going to be cutting it at an angle. I'm going to just make sure that you can see what I'm doing. Let me roll this up some. So I've come up to my seam. Here's my elastic, and I know I'm going to have my other piece of elastic coming down this way. So I'm just going to cut it at an angle like that so that my next piece can abut it right there. So now, once you've taken your time to line it all up, because this is the most prominent and noticeable part of your bra, is the center front and center back, because that's where the emphasis is on. Now it's time to sew it. This is a quick clip of me just sewing the elastic in, starting on that V, and just take your time. There's no rush. You want this edge to look really neat and nice. Now my elastic just went off course here. Let's do that again. As with sewing, there's always sometimes going to be some frustrations. That's just kind of the way it goes. I'm going to slow myself down so I can really do a good job, and I'm just going to increase the width of my zigzag to cover that whole edge of the elastic. And you can see how much my walking foot really helps to move the fabric through. And I have my edges all lined up. I guess I could probably go a little faster. Do one last check with those shoulder seams, make sure the seams are nested, and just go right over them. Things aren't exactly right, it's fine. These are knit fabrics, they will stretch into place. It's hard to go wrong. As long as you've taken the time to prepare everything, it'll all be fine. And here I'm coming up to my center back. Just take the clip out. Just making sure my pieces are still over top of each other, and you can see how my elastic is going to be sewn in there. And I should really take that pin out. Sometimes you just have to live a little. I'm not even going to backstitch because I'm going to be sewing over this again. And take it all out. So we'll come back to the table. So I've used this white elastic so you can actually see it on the camera. It's a little bit wavy, which I don't love, but this is all going to stretch a lot on my body. And once it's on, I don't think it's going to be wavy. However, I am going to increase my tension just a little bit so it won't be as wavy on the other side. So now it's time to add the elastic to the other side, and it will be the same process. I'm going to just cut this edge so it will match. I'm just going to zoom in here so it will match the other side. So I'm just going to cut it like that. You can see it's quite pointed, and I'm going to pin it right to the other side there so it matches right up, and it will actually lie quite flat on the body. So I'm going to do the exact same thing I did before. Match my shoulder points, match my V, and sew it on. The next step, in order for this V to lie nice and flat on your body, you do need to clip in. You do need to cut it right to the seam line. Let me see if I can zoom in on mine. So there's one of my V's, and I'm going to cut right into that seam line, and this is going to allow it to, my scissors aren't very sharp. That's going to allow it to lay flat and not bubble. Sorry, my scissors aren't very sharp here, so I'm just going to, but yeah, you do want to cut in. See how much I've cut there? Right to the stitches, and do it on both center front and center back. So this is what your bra should look like right now. It should be sewn around the center and right sides together. The next step, if you want, you can open it up. The green tape is my lining. The other piece is my fashion fabric. And you can understitch your seam that you just did, this center seam. And that means just lightly pulling the pieces apart and sewing with a zigzag stitch on top of the seam on the lining side. So with a pen, I can show you, or a chopstick. So basically, we're sewing as close as possible, about anywhere from 2 to 5 millimeters away from the actual seam, and we're sewing a zigzag stitch on top, and that's going to keep your lining fabric in towards where it needs to be. And you won't see it from the outside, from the main fabric. It will be along the lining fabric. But you do it by pulling the pieces apart at the seam, pressing the seam towards the lining, and sewing just along on top of the seam allowance, right along the seam. I'll do that at my sewing machine. So here I have my fashion fabric, and here I have my lining fabric. This is my seam that I'm understitching, and I've pressed my seam towards my lining fabric, and I'm simply going to go right close to the seam with a zigzag stitch. And this will only be visible from the inside. And you can just go as close as you can to your V here, but you don't have to go up to it. Even just an inch away, it's still going to be fine, which is what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to back tuck. And then I'll start again on the other side. But that's what you're looking at, and that's going to keep your seam turned in and a nice clean edge for your front. So you can do that all along the whole neckline if you want. So what should you do if your V doesn't look great? If it's kind of bubbling, it doesn't look like a V, etc. What you can do is flip it inside out again and trim down the seam allowances as much as possible. So what I mean is cutting these seam allowances here a little bit more, or go in just for the last few inches of this V and do a straight stitch. So that's exactly what I'm going to do, is I'm going to do a straight stitch and make a really sharp point and straight stitch out of the V, and then continue on with the zigzag. So I'm just going to go in and fix this and make sure it's nice and sharp. So I'm just tidying up my V point, and what I'm doing is for the last inch on either side, I'm going to do a straight stitch. You can also do a straight stretch stitch, and I've marked with a pen where I want to pivot my needle. So I'm just going to go in and do that now. You can always redraw that V to be where you want it. You can go a little bit deeper, go a little shallower. In this case, I'm going a little bit deeper so I can cut in and make it really concise. So now that I've done that, I can take my scissors and cut right into my stitching. Again, my scissors aren't that great. And trim away a lot of this seam allowance so it's not in the way of that V trying to form. Sorry, my scissors aren't that great. You can cut into your elastic, that's no big deal. It's just there for support. So cut away the seam allowance. I'll bring this over here. So you can see I've cut right into where my dot is that I drew, and I've cut away the seam allowance to help that V-neck form. So as you can see, with just extending the V a little bit, redoing it, even if you have to do some straight stitches just in this area, you can get that to form well. Once I press this, it will go right into shape. And I will just go ahead and do that to the back. So you can go ahead and press your inside seam here if you like. I don't generally press knits while I'm sewing. I'm going to skip pressing it. So the next step is we want to finish off this shoulder seam and underarm seam. So you're going to lay your bodice out like this with the right side up. And you're going to open up one side, fashion fabric and lining, just like this. Just open it right up. And you're going to take your other side that's not opened up and you're going to start to roll it. And what we want to do is tuck it right into the middle of the side that you had opened up. And I'm actually going to take a pin and just pin it right in the middle to make sure it stays where I want it to stay. So now that we have that rolled up right along the center, this is where we take one side of the lining and we're going to fold it right sides together to the side of the fashion fabric. Again, lining up your shoulder seams as much as you can and pinning or clipping. So everything is tucked right into the shoulder seam. And we're going to match the edges all the way around. So again, this is tucked in and I'm putting it right sides together, just folding it over. And we're going to clip this whole seam. So once you've pinned or clipped your whole edge here, this is what it should look like. And you're going to sew from one edge all the way around to here with a serger, zigzag, lightning stitch, whatever you prefer. And again, you can sew elastic into this edge if you like. It gives it a nice stable edge and it's a choice, but it will improve the look and wearability of your garment. So this is what you should have when you're finished sewing that burrito roll seam. And you can open it up and just start pulling through the shoulder seam and the whole thing is going to come out. Some people I think call it birthing. So now it's out and that seam is done. And you can understitch it as much as you can kind of reach. You might have to stop about here, but you can understitch this part here, which I'm going to do before I burrito the other side. Once I had pulled that through the shoulder, I noticed one little part here that didn't get caught in the stitches, so essentially a hole. So you can pull it all the way back through and redo any portions that you may have missed, or if you want just to check it. So anyways, now I can pull it through again, knowing that it's all sewn and there's no holes. So I'll pull that through. And I'm just going to understitch, let me write this again here. I'm just going to understitch just underneath the arm as far as I can. And this is what I mean by understitching. You won't be able to get up very far. I have only been able to understitch up to here. And then of course I can't spread this apart anymore, which is completely fine. So I've just understitched a little bit here and a little bit over here. So now it's time to burrito roll the other seam. I'm just going to do it the exact same way. This is the seam we want to burrito roll, so this is the one that we're going to open out on both sides all the way. So we have that opened out, and this is the one we're going to be rolling in towards the center of, of that, right along the shoulder seam. So we're rolling that up. You can see it there. I like to pin it because this is so narrow that I don't want it to get caught in the seam I'm going to be doing. So I like to put a little pin there, and then we're going to take this. So we're going to take this side and match it to that side and add some clips along here. And we'll be matching the shoulder seams. As always, nesting them, making sure they're going in different directions so that it's not too hard for your machine to go over. You can use a hump jumper there as well if you're finding the seams are getting too thick to do. And continue pinning, and then we'll sew it in the exact same fashion. And before turning it through, just check both sides, especially if you have serged it, to make sure you've caught the whole fabric. I can see right here, there's one little spot that I didn't catch. So I'm just gonna go ahead with my regular sewing machine and sew over that. And then I'll pull it through, being mindful of that if you pinned it, being mindful of that pin. My other tip too, which I forgot to say, is that when I do apply elastic, I don't go all the way to the edge where I'm going to be sewing again, just to try to stop it to be so bulky. So that's just a little tip. So your bodice should look like this. And now it's time to close up the side seams. So what we're going to do, let's move it up a bit. We're going to open up these seams here on both sides. We're going to put everything right sides together. So then this is your front, and you've opened it up. And then you're going to take your back and lay it right sides down, opening this up and matching up the side seams. And we're going to sew that right sides together from the top of the lining through to the intersecting seam through to the fashion fabric. So basically you have a funny looking rectangle with everything kind of tucked in there, and you're sewing these side seams here while nesting the intersecting seams. So the bra portion of the bra is done. Next, we're going to work on the underbust band, or in the pattern they're calling it the waistband. So you should have folded, or you should have cut out a piece on the fold according to the pattern specifications of the band size that you wanted. And it's folded here, and you're going to sew these short sides together with a zigzag, stretch stitch, serging, or lightning stitch, whatever you have that you've been using that's a stretch stitch. So you've sewn the waistband short edge sides to form a loop. And now you want this seam to be on the inside. We're going to fold it in half, and again nest those seams so that they're slightly off from each other to make it easier to sew. And we're just going to pin that in place. And then we're going to quarter this. We're going to find the quarters. So we're going to fold it completely in half. And the opposite end of where the first pin is where you're going to put your second pin. And then you're going to fold those two pins or clips together, and that will give you the quarter point. So you'll pin on either side of that too. I just need both hands to do that here, while maintaining that fold in the fabric. So there's my quarter point right there. And my other quarter point. If you want, you can baste this with a zigzag stitch to keep the two sides together. I've done this band quite a few times. I'm not going to, but I used to do that when I first started out because it was very helpful. Then you're going to take your top and you're going to take your band, flip it so the fold is going up, and put your bra inside the band. Like such, and you're going to match up your points So you're going to match up your center front with one of your pins or clips and go around the whole thing, matching up your quarter points. And this is what you should have, is this pinned all the way around evenly. It is a lot, it is 4 layers, so take your time making sure you catch all of the layers in your stitching. And you can add an elastic in here if you want. I'm not going to. I feel with 4 layers of fabric, it's going to hold itself well in position on me, but I'm not very big chested. If you want a little bit more support, you can certainly put an elastic in there. So I'm going to sew this up now with my serger. So once you've sewn this last seam, you are done. Congratulations. I do know that when I'm sewing on my serger and I come up to where I started my seam, I don't use fray check or thread the thread underneath the loops. I just go back to my regular sewing machine and use a zigzag and just zigzag over that for a quick, sure finish. So now you can turn down your waistband. You can give the whole thing a good press. This is the back. If you don't quite like how your seam has lined up, you can always go back and do that again. The other thing you can do is, I know there's a lot of layers in this seam. You can top stitch this down, and I would top stitch it facing down the seam because there's a lot of layers at the intersections. So I am going to go ahead and do that. Top stitch it up towards the bra, and that will help with all the layers and intersections. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and give it a press, and then you're done.